The Battle of Fowltown, fought in November 1817, is considered one of the opening skirmishes of the First Seminole War between the United States Army and the Seminole people. This conflict marked the beginning of a long and bitter struggle between the U.S. and the Seminole tribes, who fiercely resisted American expansion into their lands in Florida. The battle itself is often overshadowed by larger and more well-known conflicts, but it holds significant importance as a spark that ignited the broader war. The tensions between the U.S. and the Seminole tribes were part of a larger context of conflict over land and sovereignty. The Seminoles, a Native American tribe that had migrated to Florida from the Creek Nation, were joined by escaped African slaves and other displaced Native Americans, forming a multi-ethnic community. Over time, the Seminoles developed a distinct identity, deeply rooted in the swamps and forests of Florida, and were fiercely protective of their land and independence. By the early 1800s, Florida was a contested region. It was still technically a Spanish territory, but the Spanish government had little control over the area, and American settlers were increasingly moving into the region. At the same time, Seminole villages provided refuge for runaway slaves, which further angered American slaveholders. Tensions rose to the point where the U.S. government decided to take military action to subdue the Seminoles and remove them from their land. General Andrew Jackson, who would later become the 7th President of the United States, played a prominent role in the First Seminole War, which began shortly after the Battle of Fowltown. Fowltown, a Seminole village located near the Flint River in modern-day Georgia, was one of the most significant settlements in the region. Its leader, Chief Neamathla, was outspoken in his opposition to American encroachment on Seminole land. In the lead-up to the battle, U.S. officials demanded that Neamathla and the people of Fowltown move west of the Flint River, away from the American settlers. Neamathla refused, insisting that his people had the right to remain on their ancestral land. In response, Major General Edmund P. Gaines, the commander of U.S. forces in the area, ordered a detachment of troops to confront Neamathla and force the relocation of Fowltown's inhabitants. This confrontation would lead directly to the Battle of Fowltown, which would set the stage for the broader conflict between the U.S. Army and the Seminole people. On November 21, 1817, a U.S. Army detachment, led by Major David E. Twiggs, was dispatched to Fowltown to forcibly remove the villagers. Twiggs and his troops arrived at the village early in the morning, expecting a swift and decisive outcome. However, the Seminoles were prepared to resist. Neamathla, leading a group of Seminole warriors, fought back fiercely. The battle was relatively small in terms of the number of combatants, but it was intense. The U.S. forces managed to drive the Seminoles out of Fowltown, but not without sustaining casualties. The village was burned, and the remaining Seminoles fled into the swamps. While the U.S. Army claimed victory in the Battle of Fowltown, the Seminoles saw the attack as an act of aggression and were determined to retaliate. The skirmish at Fowltown escalated into broader hostilities, which culminated in the First Seminole War. The Battle of Fowltown had immediate and far-reaching consequences. On November 30, 1817, just days after the battle, a group of Seminole warriors launched an attack on a U.S. supply boat on the Apalachicola River, known as the Scott Massacre. This attack resulted in the deaths of several U.S. soldiers, women, and children and further inflamed tensions between the U.S. government and the Seminoles. In response to the escalating violence, General Andrew Jackson led a large military force into Florida in 1818, initiating what became known as the First Seminole War. Jackson's campaign was brutal and relentless. He pursued the Seminoles deep into their territory, destroyed their villages, and executed Native American leaders. Jackson's actions also extended into Spanish-controlled Florida, as he attacked Spanish forts and settlements, which eventually led to Spain ceding Florida to the United States in 1821 through the Adams-Onis Treaty. The First Seminole War was marked by the U.S. Army's use of overwhelming force and the destruction of Seminole villages. However, the Seminoles, using guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of the difficult terrain, were able to evade capture and continue their resistance. Although the U.S. claimed victory, the war did not result in the complete subjugation of the Seminole people, and their resistance would continue in the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, and even into the Third Seminole War, 1855 to 1858. The Battle of Fowltown, though a relatively small engagement, was significant in that it signaled the beginning of a long and bloody conflict between the U.S. government and the Seminoles. The First Seminole War set the stage for future conflicts over Native American land and sovereignty, as the U.S. continued its policy of Indian removal throughout the 19th century. The Seminole people, for their part, became renowned for their fierce resistance to American expansion. They were one of the few Native American groups to successfully resist removal efforts for decades, and their defiance became a symbol of indigenous resistance to U.S. imperialism. In modern times, the memory of the Battle of Fowltown and the Seminole Wars serves as a reminder of the complex and often violent history of U.S. expansion. The Seminoles' struggle to maintain their land and way of life against overwhelming odds continues to be a source of pride for their descendants, many of whom still live in Florida today. The Battle of Fowltown was a critical moment in the early history of the United States conflicts with Native American tribes. It was the spark that ignited the First Seminole War, a conflict that had far-reaching consequences for both the Seminole people and the future of Florida. The Seminole resistance to U.S. expansion was emblematic of the broader struggle of Native American tribes across the continent, as they faced increasing pressure from settlers and the U.S. government.